I'd like to go and share with you my Devar Torah on our Torah portion. It's what we have here is a very, very well-known verse in Deuteronomy and Parshat Re'eh. Parshat Re'eh has many things. It has kashrut, it has a rendering of the holidays, but there's a lot of interpretation of the first verse. In fact, we walked over to a local Orthodox synagogue last night. I don't go inside because it's way too crowded for me. I get freaked out by sitting shoulder to shoulder, back to belly button with 100 people in a room that probably seats 25. So I asked Mirav and the girls went, and so I asked them, so how was the drash? And I said, it's observe mitzvot and do taryag mitzvot, and if you do that, it's all going to be fine, and we'll settle the whole land. Then he took it back because half the crowd is leftist, and she said, "Yeah, it's good. It's a good, efficient drash. I can't say I learned very much." And I thought, well, that's one problem when you look at the beginning of our parsha. It says, "Ro'eh anochi noten lifnechem hayom." See, I place before you today bracha uklala, a blessing and a curse. Et bracha, the blessing, asher tishmeu el mitzvot Adonai Elechem, asher anochi mitzaveh etchem hayom. The blessing, if you hearken to the commandments of Adonai your God, which I am commanding you this day, v'haklala, and the curse. Im lo tishmeu el mitzvot Adonai Elechem, if you don't observe, hearken to the commandments of Adonai your God, v'sartem min haderech, and you fall off the path, asher anochi mitzaveh etchem hayom, which I command you this day. So, if you're in the Orthodox world, when people say mitzvot, you right away think of what they call taryag mitzvot. If you haven't heard that term before, it's an interesting term. It's the Hebrew letters that count up to the 613 commandments. Taf is 400, for example. So they say the taryag mitzvot. So when you keep all the commandments. The problem is, number one, there's no agreement on exactly what the taryag mitzvot are. So Nachmanides has his counting, Maimonides has his counting. There's a book called the Levush Mordechai. He has his counting. So we don't know exactly what the count is, but that's a minor thing. That's pretty marginal. It's on the periphery. But when people think about observing the commandments, again, in the probably Orthodox, maybe conservative world, they think about keeping Shabbat, keeping kosher. That in the Musar tradition, the first great Musar book called Chovot HaLevavot, the duties of the heart, he calls the external commandments, he calls them Chovot HaEvarim, the commandment of the limbs. And what he means by that, you can see the person observe the commandment. So let's take the example of davening. You go to a synagogue, a person has a siddur, they're shuffling up and down, they're looking at the book, you say, oh, they're observing the commandment of prayer. Well, how do we possibly know that? Because we don't know why they're going, if going through the motions, what's going on in their heart. So Bachya writes this book called Chovot HaLevavot, the duties of the heart, which itself was written around the year 1000 in Arabic. But he summarizes the tradition that you find in Psalms, in Proverbs, in the Talmud, many places that do put a focus on, first of all, kavanah, inner intentionality, even when you observe, observe as in do, even when you observe an observable mitzvah, we don't know if you have kavanah. And there's some who say, like Maimonides, if you do not have kavanah, inner intentionality, you're not performing the mitzvah. Others do say, as long as you show up and go through the motions, you get the check of having observed the mitzvah. And other people, including the Hasidic tradition, say nobody gets off that easy. You have to have kavanah for a mitzvah to count. So I'm going to put that aside because when I go into, for example, the book of Psalms and the book of Proverbs and other places, there's very little on observing the external commandments, the so-called Taryag mitzvot, and a great focus on the inner life. Uh, for example, some of my favorite quotes from Psalm 119 are Gal einai ve'abita, open my eyes that I may behold. niflaot mitoratecha, the wondrous things of your teaching. Is that a mitzvah? Is that something that you have to do at certain times of the day? Well, mitzvot like that, I mean, instructions on the inner life like that, as a non-Orthodox Jew, as someone who does not quote unquote observe mitzvot as an Orthodox or conservative Jew, I look for the inner life instruction. But of course, there are inner life mitzvot, such as don't hold resentment, love your neighbor as yourself, um, uh, do not oppress your neighbor even in your heart. There's a great tradition about, you may remember this, about the sabbatical year, where we have a commandment at the end of I'm sorry, the Yovel, the Jubilee, to turn land over to its original owners. Every 50 years, there's a reset. The land goes back to the original owner. So therefore, when you sell land, you're not selling land in perpetuity, you're selling time. If there's 5 years left in the Yovel, the person gets 5 years use of the land because then it goes back to the original owner. Now, even the Bible could see this is a big problem. What does it mean to sell anything such as land? And the Bible, the Talmud, commenting on this, the Talmud sums it up as there are some commandments where it just says, do the commandment, and other commandments where it says, Vayareta Adonai Elohecha, and you shall hold God in awe. And so the Talmud asks, why is it that some commandments just tell you to do them, and other commandments have this additional instruction, you shall hold God in awe? And it gives several examples of things where the additional words hold God in awe are said. And one of them, I think I've taught this ever since I taught this page of the Talmud from Babylonian Talmud, page 58b. This was a big thing when I in my 20s. You want to buy something, you go into an electronic shop and you get all the information from the salesperson who has a expectation that if they convince you, you'll buy it from them. And then you walk out and go over to Radio Shack or Costco and you buy it, having used up this person's time. So the question is that theft? Now, a person could plausibly say, well, I got all the information when I left. I got in my car. I thought about it. I just happened to be driving past Costco. I went in and I got the thing. Or you went in with the intention to use up a salesperson's time and take that information and go buy the product. Nobody knows. And it gives a long list of things that a person could have plausible deniability. One of them was, for example, pointing out the sins of a criminal who has already done their time. So you could say in public. So what was jail like? And person says, that's really offensive. Like the guy did his time and let it go. He says, oh, no, I didn't mean anything. I was just curious. Well, how do we know? Did the person want everybody to know we got an ex-con in the group? Or was this person innocently bringing up their criminal history? So the Talmud says, don't do that. You never bring up someone else's past sins in public. And even if you have plausible deniability, it was an innocent question because of the damage that it does to some people. So if you go to the Talmud, Baba Metzia 58b and on, there's a great focus on the mitzvot or the prohibitions that have misurim belev, that are hidden to the heart, and only God can see inside the heart. So there are many people who live mitzvah lives. They go, oh, Orthodox Jew, and whatever they dress a certain way and they keep kosher, keep Shabbos, and we think that they're on a higher level of holiness. I hear people say that to me. Once I began observing the religion, I felt, more highly spiritual. I go, oh, okay, that is plausible, except not predictable, because many people keep the Orthodox commandments and because they want to be seen as Orthodox, not because it's what I'll call transformative. When it hits the soul, it's transformative. So when I look at this bracha and klala, I go to the transformative dimension of the mitzvot, because bracha and klala, the way you know that you're doing the commandments is because of an external affirmation. So a few chapters later, in fact, I marked it in case you want to take a look at them. So what are the brachot and klalot? What are the blessings and curses? Well, you have to go over to Torah portion Kitavo, Deuteronomy chapter 28. If you observe God's commandments, you'll be blessed in the city, blessed in the field. Blessed shall be the fruit of your womb, the fruit of the ground, the fruit of your animals, your fruit basket, your netting bowl, all these wonderful blessings. But notice they're in the external world. So if my external world is producing, joy and wealth and comfort, I must be keeping the commandments, right? That's what it says. That is the sign. And then you go to the admissions, the klalot of disobedience. And what does it say here? You will be cursed of the fruit of your womb, cursed the fruit of the ground. You will be cursed everywhere you go. God will attach a plague to you until it consumes you from the ground that you are on, strike you with swelling lesions, fever, burning heat, thirst, sword, wind blast, withering. They'll pursue you everywhere you go. Skipping down, Adonai will strike you with the boils of Egypt, with hemorrhoids, with wet boils and dry boils, which you cannot be cured. Adonai will strike you with madness and with blindness and confounding of the heart. So someone says, I'm going crazy and I became blind. Well, then you're obviously not observing the commandments, because if you're observing the commandments, you wouldn't have mental confusion. You wouldn't have any kind of confusion about morality, timhon halev, and you wouldn't be blind. So obviously you've done something terribly wrong. Now, we all know how utterly offensive this is. This idea as well, you must have, I used to say this again when I was a young rabbi. People go to the hospital and say, well, you must have done something. And I say to people, no, 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 no. Don't go to the hospital and visit a person and say, you must have done something. You better check yourself out, because, God is in charge, and or the universe or some other great calculus machine. And as we know from the book of Job, who didn't deserve anything, don't be like a friend of Job that says, you would not have suffered so much had you not done something. Now, we, the reader who's read the book of Job 1 and 2, Job didn't do anything. It was a bet between God and Satan, whether Satan could turn Job against God. So we, the readers of the book of Job, we know that it is not about suffering. It's about a fickle God that does not deserve the title God, who's, Satan says, nah, he's only worshiping you because you bless him. And God goes, oh, really? He doesn't really love me? No, he doesn't really love you. You keep doing good things for him because he acts like a good guy. So God says in the book of Job, this wonderful little play, well, do anything you want to him, just don't kill him. And so Satan destroys his life. And Job says, yeah, I didn't do anything. And his friends say, Job, just admit you did something. He goes, yeah, I didn't do anything. So you guys shut up. And, if God wants to tell me what I did, have him come here right now. So you read this whole book of these speeches of his friends. You must have done something, Job. And Job says, yeah, what? Well, you must have done something, until God shows up out of the whirlwind and says to Job, where were you when I created the world and created the rivers and the mountains and so forth? Where were you? And, we read it and we say, yeah, you're not answering the question. You're saying, I'm powerful. So what? So there's this great confrontation eventually between God and Job. Job holds his ground. I think it's one of the most wonderful chapters in the Bible. God backs down. Okay. So Job, like that Tom Petty song, don't back down. Job did not back down, eyeball to eyeball. Finally, God backed down. So the book of Job is not about the suffering of Job. It's about God actually having a very craven moment, and the guy who does not believe in this theology, if something bad happened, I must have done something wrong. Job says, actually, no, I'm gonna hold my ground, and I'm gonna call God into account. And lo and behold, God even shows up and has a public argument with Job, and God loses the argument. How'd that book end into the Bible? Right? I think maybe it's one of the most honest books in the Bible, where it basically says the fact that we're suffering does not mean we've done bad things. And the fact that you are enjoying blessings does not mean you've done good things. They don't have any meaning at all. Meaning, joy or suffering in life might be connected to your moral life. Meaning, if you don't cheat, lie, and steal, people might like you and you might be more prosperous in business. But it is not as if there's a calculus that will say, since you don't cheat, lie, or steal, blessings come your way. It just might be a function of your reputation or the way you handle yourself in the world. So there might be a connection, but there are people who are despicable in their business lives, and they bully people and they threaten people, and they also make a living. So the book of Job really takes this idea of, if you observe the commandments, you will be blessed, and if you don't, you will be cursed. So the book of Job, in many ways, completely undoes the book of Deuteronomy. It's not a bad way to see Job. The book of Deuteronomy is very strident, very militant about doing the mitzvahs. And you read the book of Job, and I think the book of Deuteronomy says, yeah, you have a point there. Just stay quiet. We would, like, Job, wouldn't you rather people observe the commandments? I wouldn't be like that better off. Yeah. Okay. So if you be quiet, maybe these people will act better. So I just imagine this argument between the book of Deuteronomy and the book of Job. And Job says, "Yeah, you know you don't believe in what you're saying, but I won't say it everywhere." Which is why the book of Job is so long and difficult. So people they read the book of Deuteronomy, it's the Torah portion, and they don't read the book of Job so much. All right, so my position is people do not suffer because they do or do not do mitzvot. My perspective is you're not prosperous whether you do mitzvot or even whether you are a good person. Think of all the wonderful good people who died, who were victims of genocide and atrocities, good people. So that's why I've ever since I was a young person in college, I completely reject this idea. It's called theodicy, the justice of God. I've never believed in the argument that doing commandments, in particular, being a good person in general, assures blessing or curse, as the case may be. So I reject the traditions of theodicy entirely. And then, so people, as you can imagine, have asked me, well, how can you be a rabbi? I said, because they gave me a certificate. That's how I can be a rabbi. It's like, yeah. They didn't ask me that. Like, am I really? They said, do you believe in theodicy? No, we're not signing it. I finished my classes. I got my smicha certificate. I think it makes me a better rabbi because I have to really think this thing through. All right. So now, what does our tradition do with these wonderful statements? The tradition, there's a wonderful reading in the book of the Zohar, volume 1, page 52b. You can find it on Sefaria, right? It has this wonderful, wonderful section. And it says before Adam and Eve, so remember, his name is not Adam, it's Ha Adam, which is the human being, but for convenience sake, we'll say two people called Adam and Eve. Uh, Before they ate from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, it says they had chokmah ila'a, nihiru. They were enlightened people that knew all the secrets of the universe. When they ate from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, I gotta say it all. The fruit from the tree, eitz da'at tov v'ra, pre eitz da'at tov v'ra, the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. After they ate from it, their knowledge plummeted. And that's when you see the little joke uh, uh, within those words is the knowledge of good and evil, not good from evil. Now, I haven't seen a commentator make this exact point. Maybe I'm just not that well read, but I think it makes a huge difference. I know there's good and evil, but I don't really know if I ask myself which is good and which is evil. I just know that they are there. So what do people tend to do? They assume that what they do, what they think is good, blessing, life, and their opponents are doing klalo, they're doing, bringing curses, and they're not right, and they're not good. That's the natural status of the human being. When you look at yourself in the world, you are standing on the tip of the mountain of light, and other people are in the nadir of the mountain of darkness, and that's how you go through life. That same page of the Zohar then says, and then God was going to restore us to our natural condition of enlightened human beings at Matan Torah, at the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. And it says, so when God spoke the commandments, all of a sudden we all popped to and saw the secrets of the universe. I don't know how this could happen, all these enlightened people, but then they built the molten calf. I don't understand how that could happen, but I don't think the Zohar doesn't talk about it, just wants to set this thing up. This is when they built the molten calf. They went even lower than Adam and Eve, meaning building the molten calf was not just rejecting the commandments, but rejecting being an enlightened person. Rejecting being an enlightened person. So, by implication, the Zohar is saying that is the human condition. We are not enlightened people. We don't really know. We know there is good and evil. We just don't know the difference. We typically think that we're good and they are evil. And it's a pretty easy world to live in, meaning, what's a bracha? Helps you enjoy life. What's a klala? Makes you suffer. So two things happen. You assume, well, since I'm doing okay, I must be living the truth, um, and avoid suffering. Now, the second part of what I'm saying is crucial. People live lives avoiding suffering, especially suffering that comes from self-examination. And why? Because it's natural in us to avoid suffering and maximize pleasure, maximize joy. That's the natural human condition. But M. Scott Peck, in his wonderful book, Road Less Traveled, he said most people have neurosis because they avoid, um, I'll say, good suffering. The good suffering that you're not going to get your needs met, the good suffering that life is limited, the good suffering that we don't know enough. So when people live a certain way, everybody else is bad, I'm good, I know what I'm doing. It's kind of joyful to be smarter than everybody. And it's kind of painful to say, yeah, I think it, but I might be wrong. And could be that the things I do are causing terrible suffering to myself and other people. Like who talks that way? So M. Scott Peck says, and he says this in the first part of the book. It's a written in the early 70s, I think. It's still a wonderful, wonderful book to read if you haven't read it. And he begins the book, Life is Suffering. If you avoid suffering, you will never be an enlightened person. Now, isn't this an interesting perspective? Um, so when do I see this in my counseling practice? I see in my counseling practice a person brings up a problem partly because they're holding something to be true. They're holding something to be true. And typically it has to do with couples reliance on the fact that their wife or husband loves them, reliance on their theory of marriage of how things should be, and they think they're right. So they say, well, I know my husband loves me. Now, from what I've heard, it's doubtful. And I say, well, you're really suffering, yes. Well, he's just not saying what's in his heart. So the fact that he's mean to you is because he's not saying what's in his heart, because what's in his heart is love for you, right? Yes. I said, what if that's not true? Oh, Rabbi, you can't think that. So I'm not thinking it, I'm just asking, although I am thinking it. Uh, Another person, well, isn't it obvious what children, parents, spouses are supposed to do? I said, it's not obvious to me. They said, well, everybody does this. I said, yeah, but not in your family. So maybe you don't know what everybody does. You don't have a peek behind the curtains to probably any family but your own. So you really don't know what other people do. There's a small set of people who do, and those are we who counsel other people. And we've heard and see things that we can't unhear and can't unsee. So what we're used to is people who live under what in the spiritual tradition is called Olama de Shikara, the people of the big lie. Now they live the big lie so that they can, again, I'm taking from M. Scott Peck and a little bit from the Zohar tradition here. They live the big lie to avoid the suffering of self-examination. I'll give you a classic case. Just happened this week. Um, so I'm known in a odd assemblage of people. Like there's professors and drunks and charlatans and rabbis, and we all get together once a week. And so they know I'm a counselor. They say, well, ask Finley. He does this stuff. So this one guy says, oh, okay, so I'm going to ask you a question. He says, my wife used to swim and she used to read and do all these things, and then she got pregnant and stopped swimming and stopped reading and just watches TV all day and gets on the phone with her friends. And I tell her, we should go back to your swimming. It doesn't matter that you're pregnant. You're going to get out of the habit. And you should read books. What are you watching all this TV about? And all you days you talk on the phone with your friends. That's a really terrible. So I'm listening. I'm listening. I'm listening. I say, so you're giving her good advice. He says, yeah, and your good advice will improve her life as she follows. He says, absolutely. So how often have you given this advice? Every day. I got to tell her I got to remind her what the right way to live is. I said, okay, so what if I said to you the possibility that your advice is shaming her? He said, it's odd. That's exactly what she said. She said, I already feel enough shame for myself. You don't have to add on to it. I said, then why do you say it? Well, somebody has to. That's my job as a husband. I said, let me compress this. My job as a husband is to make my wife suffer. Oh, yeah, but it's for a good cause. I said, forget the good cause because your advice hasn't done anything for your wife. He said, okay, you're right. But, and then he came like, why he is this way. He said, well, if you met my father, my family, we're all a bunch of big mouths and we don't know how to shut up and we're very critical. So that's just kind of like how I was raised. I said, so that's why you do it. He goes, yeah, I do it because of how I was raised. I said, I'm not buying it. I'm not buying it. He says, what do you mean? I said, because you know it's wrong, right? And no matter how you were raised, you can blame DNA, you can blame modeling, but at a certain point, if you really think I'm causing another person needless suffering, you know you're supposed to stop. So we're going back between, well, I can't stop because of my personality and my family. I said, let me take you on a journey. So I said, are we okay doing this in public? He goes, yeah, sure, whatever. The other guy said, yeah, what do you have to say, Finley? So I took him on a journey from his conscious mind through his personality, under his personality to his soul, the world of value. I see the operative value in your marriage is love. Can you feel the love of your wife? Can you go down in the world of the soul, get past your argumentative, critical personality, get back, get, go beyond your family tradition of causing people needless suffering, and go to the world of your soul and look at your wife from your soul. I said, she's suffering. She's suffering terribly. I don't know what. I have a theory, but I don't know your wife. But I can tell you, coming home where you put in a long day's work and chastising her that she's not doing her share, you're causing her suffering. So when you say, I'm benefiting her by giving her advice to make himself feel better, in my opinion, so he at least has something to say, I said, that's called a big lie. Because if it were benefiting her, you would have seen it a long time ago. In fact, you're adding to her suffering. So I like had to stay in the world of the soul, and everybody went there. A couple guys that are crying, including me. We come up and we say, we say and do things that are just have no connection with the truth. We have that line from Psalms 15, Dover emet bilvavo. He speaks the truth in his heart, which means it goes way down under the world of the soul, that examines all of the behaviors and all of our reasons and all of our excuses. And we realize, I'm just lying to myself. I'm not creating any good. I'm not creating a bracha. In fact, here's where I sealed it because this Torah portion is coming up. I said, I think your wife would assume that you're the klala, you're the curse. He said, well, that's an overstatement. I said, admittedly. But when you walk through the door, I think your wife says, oh my God, here it comes. Here it comes. That's a curse. You're not a bracha. When you walk in the door, she's not saying, blessings have arrived. She says, the curse has arrived. And he's just going to make her feel horrible for the next hour. Then, of course, she argues back. I'm this and I'm this. And they have a bad argument. And he says, my marriage is being torn apart because she doesn't do things. And I said to him, man, I haven't known you very long, but I'm so sorry to say this, but I'm going to speak straight out of the spiritual tradition. You're lying. You're lying. You know it doesn't make anything better. People do it because they want to have the moral high ground. And they also do it because they don't want to suffer. So he said, no, explain that to me. So it's nice in Hebrew, you have this word in Hebrew called yisurin, suffering. And one of the main uses of yisurin is yisurei leda, the suffering of childbirth. And the suffering of childbirth in spiritual psychology is the suffering involved in the birthing of the new self, the labor pains of birthing the new self. For a new self to be born, you've got to give up the old self. Now, we are attached to the old self. We don't want a new self. Something in says, why would I rip apart everything I know is right, just to be a person of truth? I'd just rather be right. And then there are people that say, I'm willing to go through this. Sometimes I'll ask a client, like, what's the pain? What do you want? And what are you willing to do? And I finally get to, I'm willing to suffer. Are you willing to suffer to get through this? And I would think authentic suffering, because part of what authentic suffering is admitting the truth about yourself, understanding the truth of a situation, understanding the inner lives of other people, what you're doing to this mix, and you will notice things about yourself that are not good, not righteous, and not holy. And then you have the terrible project ahead of you of transformation, which is extremely painful. Transformation is extremely painful because we're taking, habits set in the brain that are not good habits. Like Good People, Bad Habits, the book that I'm rewriting. I'm a good person with terrible habits. How do I know terrible? Because they cause other people to suffer. They cause me to suffer. Do you want to cause people to suffer yeah, less? Yes. Would you like to suffer less? Yes. What will you do? And the right answer is whatever it takes. That's the only right answer. I will do whatever it takes to relieve the suffering of my soul by becoming a person of truth. That's the main path that I teach. And relieve the suffering of others, not living under the lie that when I say what I think about them, I'm adding a blessing to their life. So when we think of bracha and klala, we think if I feel good, if I enjoy life, I have the blessing, and if I feel bad, I have the klala. When it actually might be the opposite. It might be the opposite. If you're not suffering the birth pangs of growth, you will never be a blessing to other people or to yourself. And if you're pretty set in your ways and you think you're blessed, you might be living under the curse of the person who refuses to go through the process of transformation. So in the inner life tradition, these things are set against each other. That reminds me of a statement in the Talmud in the Tractate Sanhedrin somewhere where there's two property owners who have adjacent property. They're disputing each other, and they go to the rabbi, and the rabbi, quoting Aramaic, he says, "Kishot et atzmecha, v'acharcha kishot achirim." Now, kishot in Aramaic, incredibly, both means both beauty and truth. Kishot atzmecha, beautify yourself. Then go start going around and beautifying other people. Like, nah, you're not beautiful enough. I'm going to make you beautiful. Well, make sure that you're a beautiful human being first. And then it's kishot et asmecha, meaning be straight with yourself, then walk around being straight with other people. So oftentimes people are going to be so straight with other people, they're the last people to be straight with themselves. Because if they're straight with other people, they wouldn't walk around indiscriminately, uninvited, trying to straighten other people out. Seems obvious, right? If you're straight with yourself and you have deep self-knowledge, including the suffering you cause yourself and other people, you won't walk around straightening other people out and causing them suffering. If you want to help someone change, there's way better ways to do it than shame them, to make them feel bad about themselves. So for me, this parsha sets up beautifully the high holidays, which in the Hasidic tradition is called Shana, Rosh Hashanah. They say it is Rosh Hishtanut, the beginning of transformation. So one thing that I say is, if you're not planning, if you don't have a plan of transformation, you're not observing Rosh Hashanah. It's in the Hasidic tradition. You have a plan of Hishtanut. And so what's the plan? Like Abraham in the book of Genesis, to become a blessing. So for all of us, for all of you, a year of transformation and your will and intent to be a blessing for yourself and other people.